Okay guys, welcome back to part 2. Today we're going to look at the phosphorus cycle. Now you don't need to be able to draw or label the phosphorus cycle, but you do need to know quite a lot about it. Now it's quite easily forgotten, the stuff on the phosphorus cycle, but it is nonetheless a very, very important element. Okay, so phosphate generally is found in rocks over here. Now phosphate of course is an ion, but it's also a solid. Okay, so you can imagine the phosphorus cycle being a much slower one than the nitrogen cycle or the carbon cycle. So the actual turning over from sink to source is much slower. So generally what happens is you've got phosphate in rock. The weathering of that rock in natural form, okay, the weathering of the rock, okay, wind, rain, ice, okay, causes the rock to break up into smaller pieces, and then it gets deposited across the land and gets into oceans. Of course, then phosphate dissolves in the oceans and is uptaken by marine plants, then into animals, and of course, as they die, it goes into sediment. Of course, in the years as we see them now, there is a lot more commercial use of phosphate. So the process of actually getting the phosphate from the rock has increased a huge amount. And so that phosphate is being used to turn it into fertilizer. The fertilizer, of course, goes into the ground and again gets washed away by the wind and the rain and ends up again back in our oceans at a faster and faster rate. Or it gets taken up by our plants and we get more and more plants. And then those plants are used to feed animals for commercial farming as well. So why do we need phosphorus anyway? What's the purpose of phosphorus? So we need it, of course, to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate. DNA and RNA is also an integral part of. Cell membranes is an integral part of. And of course, our skeletons. And so it is a very, very important element itself. So phosphate, like we said, is mined and converted into phosphate-based fertilizer. Fertilizer is then transported a huge distance across the earth to wherever it's needed and turned into fertilizer. Phosphorus then is, of course, taken into the biomass of crops and it's transferred from fields in one area into markets in other areas. So because of this, the demand for artificial fertilizer is very, very high, and consequently, phosphate mining is being carried out much more quickly than the rocks can be naturally formed and hence replenished. Therefore, like we know of greenhouse or fossil fuels, okay, we're running out of them. Okay, we're using them at a faster rate than they can be recovered naturally, and they're running out. Now you can see this is a graph based on US Geological Survey date and shows world phosphate production iron mining, and it's showing the increase all the way through. So world production has varied greatly, but overall there's been smaller increases to production after than before 1980. So it seems to be slowing down a bit here. So as the reverse of phosphate rock are depleted, the production of phosphorus is like to peak and then decline. Through some sources, the peak is likely to occur in the next 30 years. It is difficult to judge due to the fact that new phosphate mineral deposits are still being discovered. Now, if we don't have phosphate, what are the consequences of that? Well, if we don't have phosphate to put into fertilizer, our yields of our crops are going to decrease. And so obviously there's an economic crisis there, but also obviously it means that certain crops aren't going to get grown, which can mean starvation in some parts of the world. Now, unfortunately, there's no way to synthetically make phosphate at the moment. And so there are no sources of phosphate fertilizer other than what's coming from the ground. By using more and more of this, what's going to happen is, unfortunately, the phosphate that's in our fertilizers gets washed out of the soils, and it gets washed away by the rain. It gets washed into waterways like lakes and rivers. And you can see in this particular waterway here, it's turned green, and that's because there is a green algae which is taking in those phosphates, it's living on the surface of the water, taking in those phosphates, and has had a period of exponential growth. Okay, and so what's happened, of course, is they've gone past K and they're growing and growing and growing and growing. They've got plenty of sunlight, they've got plenty of phosphate, and so There's nothing limiting their population growth. And of course, eventually, that was all going to come to an end as limiting factors come into play, and those algae are going to die. Now, before that happens, of course, okay, obviously with the green algae on the top, these photosynthetic algae, it means all the sunlight that's hitting the water is being absorbed on the surface layer, and the plants at the bottom of the water are not getting enough sunlight. Okay, so they're not going to be able to photosynthesize. So if you can imagine now, the plants at the bottom die, and also the algae eventually will die as well because of limiting factors coming into play. So when they die, they're going to sink down. Saprotrophs are going to come along, bacteria are going to come in and start breaking them down, and as they break them down, they're going to use up the rest of the oxygen in the water, which will kill the rest of the marine life, your fish, your other organisms, okay, and it's going to deplete all the oxygen reserves of that piece of water. And that whole process is known as eutrophication. Obviously, that can wipe out all of your commercial fish. It's going to make the water poisonous, and that's not a good thing at all. So, in summary, the deoxygenation, there will be an increase in the biological oxygen demand of the water by the bacteria. The consequences of that are death of fish or forced emigration, so they'll have to move out of their area, a reduction in overall biodiversity, so in species richness and evenness. The water transparency will become less, and so photosynthetic organisms will be much more stressed, and so the food chain will become affected. Increased levels of toxins and greater number of pathogens means water will no longer safe for bathing or drinking by humans. Okay, the last section on here is how us as people can assess the nutrient content of a soil sample. So you can see here that you've got different types of tests. You've got an N test, a test for different types of nitrogen. You've got a phosphorus test, you've got pH tests. Again, and these are just little paper tests there. You dip like the litmus paper that you can just simply dig into the ground and you'll get an instant readout. And so a farmer can use that to test how nutrient rich his soils are. So it's pretty easy to do, and these different tests are pretty easy to come across. And that's it for the phosphorus cycle. Thank you very much for listening.